Okay, everybody, let's take a look at activity 1.2. And what we're doing is we're talking about perception and how that applies to our understanding of a text. When we come to a text, those lenses that we have, those demographic and those psychographic lenses that we have, kind of start to change the way we see things, right? They change the way we perceive things, we see things, how we come to a text. Okay, so what we want to look at first here is just this idea of perception. Now, perception is one person's interpretation of sensory or conceptual information. What does that mean? When you look at something, either physical or you look at an event or you look at an idea, this is your interpretation of it. We can all look at the same thing, but those demographic and those psychographic characteristics that we have do kind of change the way those look. And then we build on that, and we build in literary criticism, the formal practice of interpreting, evaluating, and explaining the meaning of significance of literary works. Okay, what does that mean? So literary criticism is where we take a look at something and then we go through a formal process. And that formal process allows us to be very critical of the information, very critical of what they're trying to say, and really looking at what they mean. Now, within that, we have these literary theories. Now, these literary theories are like those perceptions, so they're lenses through which we can look at something. Okay, not necessarily our perceptions of something, but what does it have to do with, say monetary issues, right? Or how that applies to how the history of the time impacted that. And so we take those theories and we lay them on top of the text and then our criticism through those, okay? So those are those kinds of academic terms that we need to be aware of: perception, literary criticism, and literary theories. Now, you will probably hear a lot of those overlap, meaning that at times you will hear, oh, what's your perception of this? Talking about your criticism. We may talk about theories and criticisms together. They are separate, but there is a lot of overlap between them. Okay. Now, the thing about literary criticism is that we're not necessarily being negative or critical. We're just looking at it with a very fine eye. We want to really look at something closely, and we want to ask those questions. Why? Why did they do that? Why did they want to get that message across? Why did this particular example work or not work? Now, that could be for us, looking at how we perceived it, or could looking at the author and like, okay, how did you do this, and why did you do it that way? Okay, so it doesn't have to be critical or negative. It is just being, very looking at it with a very fine-tooth comb, right? Looking at it at a very close angle. Okay. Now, if we bounce forward here just a little bit, literary theory again. These are those ways that we look at it. These are set kind of perceptions that we use to look at text, okay? Now, we are going to be really using this reader response criticism. Now, that's the one that we are going to use the most. That's the one that's going to be the most important to us, and the one that you're going to see most often through this unit, okay? So I'll come back to that. Cultural criticism are those things that are the values that we have, right? The values that we have that are based on our society, okay? Now, that's like our social class, our ethnic class, our religious class, right? Those are these kinds of societal influences that really give us our sense of values and morals and beliefs. Now, this is an interesting piece right here. What it means to be a part of or excluded from a specific cultural group contributes to an understanding of text and relations to culture. Now, what does that mean? So if you belong to the same culture that that author is, be it religion, be it values, be it social class, whatever, right? You may see it in a very similar way. So then the thing we want to look at is, did the author want us to see it that way? Or was the author trying to make us see it in a different way? We then get this archetypal criticism. This is a lot like a stereotype, okay? And if I can write that correctly, this is the stereotype. Now, a stereotype is when we have a very particular sense of a hero, a mom, a student, right? You get like where people say, oh, it's this generation is this, right? And then we find a person that we think is most indicative of that generation. So this is where people point to like a particular influencer on TikTok and say, that's the kind of person this generation has. And we try to label this, or we try to use that one example as a model for all in that, right? A lot of times authors, especially classic authors, will use them in a very exaggerated sense, right? Like there's a lot of exaggeration that's involved in this. You think about Superman. Not only is he strong, but he's super strong, right? Not only is he super strong, but he has super abilities, right? So there's all kinds of different things that they use in this archetype. Going forward, the Marxist, and again, I think for us, this is kind of like a bad word choice for us, because again, you think about some of these filters that we have, we think of Marxists as socialists or some sort of political sense. This is economic, okay? This is economic. In other words, how does this affect my money? How does this affect how much I make or what I do with my money, right? So you think of like, you think of some of those movies like Wolf of Wall Street or some of these like super rich main characters, and they just throw money around with no regard, right? Like The Great Gatsby last year, where money was no object and getting the money was no object, right? Like that was whatever you had to do to get the money, right? These are these kinds of views that we have. Now, economics really is a driver of society. We talk about crime, we talk about societal clash, we talk about the haves versus the have-nots. This is inevitable, but it is a huge driver of a lot of things that we see. I think feminist speaks for itself, okay? This is the interpretation of literature based on gender, okay? Either that you have a particular gender, you have a particular identity, and you look at it through those lenses, okay? For instance, like a woman might pick up a particular text and really identify with one of the characters, whereas a male may pick up that text and not identify with that character just because they don't have that experience, right? Pretty straightforward. This historical criticism, I really think that this is super huge. I think this is a very important criticism, a very important lens to use as you look at something. That is huge, right? I really think that that's important because you also see it every day. Okay, anytime you watch a movie, you listen to a song, you read a text, the author many times is influenced by the history of the events of their day and what's going on and what they're familiar with, right? You think about like young adult authors. Young adult authors are trying to reach back into their youth and trying to capture some of those emotions and feelings, right? But also, too, think about like world events and how those have shaped certain texts. Think about Fahrenheit 451 or Animal Farm or 1984, right? Where a lot of these ideas of the communist movement, you think about these anarchists, you think about just societal change and technology, these things come back and they influence the way the author does. Now, the thing about this is to remember, the book may be set in a totally different historical period, but the events of that day will shape it, right? Like they put it back in the 1400s. What was going on in the 1400s? How does that influence the story? Or could it? Or maybe it's set in, say, The Crucible, which was, the 1600s, 1690s, but it was looking at something from the 1950s, right? And so even though it was set in the witch trials, it was really a message about what was going on in the 1950s. And so you really see that kind of historical influence. Okay. Then we get a little bit about the optic. And again, I think we've talked a lot about that in class, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You do have this little quick overview, and I know that you reviewed last year. You know, this is the overview is what do you see? What's your first take? When you look at that, what are the things that, you know, that jump out at you, right? What is the overall picture? You know, we look at parts, that's where we zoom in on a specific piece of something, right? So we look in there, we say, okay, what does this element mean? What does this color mean? What does this idea mean? This movement, whatever. The title, we look at the text. How does that help us put the picture into context? Interrelationships. So we talk about how elements are related, both the graphic and the text, or the visual and the meaning, right? Like, how are these things related? And then the conclusion is, what does it mean? What are we taking away from this, right? What did we get from this? Okay, I want to go back up to the reader response. And I skipped that for a reason, because this is the one that we're going to spend the most time on. This is the one that we're going to spend the most time on. In a nutshell, the easiest version is, what's your take on this? You experienced something, and then what's your take? Okay? And I'll just write that over there. What's your take? Now, this is kind of tricky, because we're not asking you to like, I like or dislike. It's more of, I identified with. This struck me. This called or spoke to me. I really was moved by this because, right? So what we really want to take from is your personal interaction with the text. Okay, your personal interaction with the text. Let's say that you read some text and you started following what it was doing. Like, one of the characters was acting a certain way. They changed their moral code. You change your moral code to kind of match that. That's a personal interaction with that text, right? How did it make you feel deep down? Did it disturb you? Did it bother you? Did it excite you? Did it motivate you, right? What was that gut level reaction? Now, when you do that with this take, the key to this is the evidence. Okay? And what does that mean for us is, and again, we do this all the time, but this piece of the text made me feel a certain way. This thing that happened in the story made me feel a certain way. This really drove me. This really, whatever, right? Because that evidence, that part of the story explains why you had that personal interaction with the text. I may not have had that same interaction. I may have identified with a different piece of the text, right? You know, and again, now this really gets back to, you know, those things that we talked about before, those demographics, those psychographics, right? Let's say that you had some sort of, you know, bad memory, and something similar in the story is happening to one of the characters. You might be reliving some of those bad memories, that trauma, because the character was going through it, and it just brings it back up, right? You know, you just recently broke up with someone, and then in the story, someone was breaking up with someone, and they're going through the same kind of heartache and pain and doubting and whatever, right? You identified with that because you just did that. You just went through that same emotion. And so that's going to be really key to how we respond to a reading, respond to a text. And again, like I said, this is going to be the most important one that we do. This is going to be the one that we spend the most time on, okay, throughout the rest of this unit.